15.
I have to say, I'm probably the only person that when we were watching Nick's talk earlier and there was a shot of Sarah Palin's dad's feet, I got envy. Well, I have to say it's a real honor to be here. Amnesty International has been an organization that I've respected for a long time and has supported me through a lot of my work. And I had to say, a year ago, before all this happened, I wouldn't have expected to find myself here talking to Amnesty in this situation. But really, that's what my talk is about this evening. It's about stories and, in my case, becoming part of that story. About 10 years ago, I had quite a change in my life. I'd been a fashion photographer and a music photographer and celebrity photographer and was having a great life. I was in my 20s, and really having a great time. And there was always, though, a nagging sense that I could do more with my work. Probably like many of you, I would sit in front of a television or read the newspaper and be affected by stories, be affected by things that were going on in the world, and feel I should be doing something towards it. But I kind of felt powerless. I felt that there was nothing I could do that could really make a difference in this world. Now, it may seem really obvious to other people, but it took a long time before I made a real link between my work as a photographer and my feelings as a humanitarian, and decided that I could use my photography as a tool to try and tell the stories of other people in other countries whose circumstances were not as good as mine. And so about 10 years ago, I made that decision. I gave up all the work I was doing. I literally put all my stuff in storage, and I set out to tell the stories of people around the world and to try and use my photography as a tool. Now, I'm not a great photographer. I'm self-taught. I kind of vaguely point the camera in the right direction. But what I've learned is the camera can be a mirror. It can reflect somebody's story, and then I can bring it back here and then transmit it to people like you, who can maybe then learn and do something about that. It's a real privilege to travel and to meet these people and to tell their stories. And so I'd like to show a few of those tonight and tell something about how I got to take those pictures. So could I have the first slide? So this picture I took in Bangladesh a few years ago. It was a really pivotal point for me. I was struggling because I was doing work that wasn't necessarily getting paid, and I was wondering if I was really doing anything that was worthwhile. I was coming back with a lot of these stories, and people weren't necessarily publishing the pictures, and I was doubting whether I had any purpose in what I was doing. And I was in Bangladesh, and I was dealing with the Rohingya refugees, and their plight is tragic. They've been living for nearly 20 years on the border between Burma and Bangladesh, forgotten. And as Bangladesh won't accept refugees as a status, they're not allowed to be helped by the UN or other organizations. So these Rohingyas are left without any medical treatment, without any aid whatsoever, and they die from most ridiculous diseases, simple things. I met a guy who was dying, a little bit of rice had got in his eye, and it scratched his cornea that had got infected, his whole face had swollen, and he was days from death. Simple antibiotics would have saved his life, but nobody's allowed to actually go and help these people. So I went there and I spoke to one of the village elders, and I said, look, I'd like to come in the next day, and I'd like to document and photograph a lot of the people here and tell their stories. So I turned up the next morning, and I got a bit of a shock because I'd made this little makeshift studio. I'd got a couple of sheets that I'd nicked from my hotel. We'd stuck them up on some bamboo, and there was maybe 100 people there with illnesses, disease, many of them lying on the floor near death, and everyone had brought them so that they could be photographed by me. I turned to the village elder and I said, look, I'm sorry, I think there's been a mistake. These people have to realize I'm not a doctor. Because they were coming up to me and they were showing me these tumors, they were showing me these illnesses, going, help. And I was going, I can't do anything, I'm just a photographer. And the village elder turned to me and he goes, for now, that's all they have. But at least you can record their stories and you can tell people. So that's what I did. And for me, it was a really turning point because it made me realize that it's important. It gives people power when they can tell their story, when they can do something so that other people can at least hear what they have to say. Then those people feel empowered, they feel strong. These two brothers, was the only time I have to say I've ever cried taking a photograph. These two brothers came for this picture. Noah and his brother Fear. And Fear had a muscle wasting disease. Nobody knew what it was because he couldn't see a doctor, and he was in agony every day. And his brother brought him down there and held him in front, and we took this portrait, and then literally he collapsed afterwards, and he was in agony. And he looked at me and he said, every day I just wish that I could die because the pain is too much, but even here I can't do that in peace. Okay, now the next slide. This is a photograph of a young woman in Bangladesh who had been attacked with acid. And it was one of the very difficult things when you're a photographer, to take a photograph of somebody that's suffering, that's had something tragic happen to them, because you feel you want to have empathy for them, you want to understand what they're going through, but inevitably they know why you're photographing them, and you're photographing them because something's happened to them. And it's a very difficult balance you always try and get with the subject, because you want them to have strength, you want them to be able to tell their story in their own right, and hopefully with this picture I was able to do that. Her story was particularly tragic. She had been attacked when she was 15, when her neighbor had several times propositioned her, wanted to marry her, and she had declined his offers because she wanted to get an education. So one day when she was walking back from school, he threw acid all over her face. The story gets even more tragic because when she came out of hospital, her family felt that she would never be able to marry anybody. The only person that would marry her was the person that attacked her. So her family decided that the best option was for her to marry her attacker. So she was forced to marry the guy that had actually done this to her. And for 10 years she lived with him. Every night, pretty much, he raped her, attacked her, and told her that nobody else would ever want her because of her disfigurements. Finally, she did run away, and she went and she joined the Acid Survivors Foundation in Dhaka, and now works as a nurse there, helping other people who are going through similar experiences. I was very honoured a couple of years ago by Amnesty, who nominated this for one of their media awards. But again, it was something ironic that it was nominated for an award and got quite a lot of publicity at that time. But at the same time, no magazine in this country wanted to run the story because, to quote one editor, it's too depressing. So I have to say again, thanks to Amnesty for at least showing this picture at that time. Okay, if I go to the next slide. This picture was taken in South Sudan a couple of years ago. I was doing a story with Médecins Sans Frontières on child labour and the difficulties they were having there. This woman had walked for almost a day because she knew something was going wrong with her childbirth. When she turned up, the situation grew quite drastic quite quickly, and there was only one doctor, an Australian doctor, and he pulled me aside and he said, this child is going to die, but worse, that it was probably going to kill the mother. There was no nurses there, and he actually asked if I could come and assist him in the procedure. And as it was going on, I had the difficult decision as to whether I should take a photograph, because it felt obviously like a very personal moment. The mother had been told that the baby was dead, but she still had to go through labour. And at this particular moment, I decided I should take a photograph, because the important thing I felt was to tell the story, was to tell her story, so that maybe other people could do something, other doctors could go and work and be involved there. Anyway, so there was just literally a moment, and I grabbed my camera, and I'm not a religious person, but there was a moment of calm. There was a moment when everything just seemed to come together with the light, everything, and I took 3 frames, I think, and then went back to assisting the doctor, and this was the photograph that came from that. On the same day, a 14-year-old boy came in who'd been shot through the stomach, and he was dying, and again, I had to go through the same sort of procedure of deciding whether I should photograph him. And that evening, I went and I sat with the Australian doctor, Dr. Murray, and I said to him, I don't think I can do this anymore. I feel useless, and I feel powerless, because I come here and I see people dying in front of me, and I can't do anything. And I see these doctors and the amazing work they do, and you're trying to save lives, but there's not enough of you, and there's too many of people like me. And he looked at me and he said, well, when I lived in Australia, I was miles away from anywhere, and he was working as a flying doctor. But he said, growing up, he'd looked at pictures of things like this and events in Africa, and that's what inspired him to go out there and do something. So he basically said that it was because of photographers that had made him go and do something. And that, again, reminded me that we're all cogs. We're all little parts in a wheel, and it's very easy to sit there and say, what can I do? I can't do anything to change the world. It's pretty scary when you look and you see a famine. It's so huge, it's so dramatic, and yeah, you think, I can't help. But you can all do something in some way. We can all be part of that mechanism that makes a change. I'm a photographer. I take pictures. I tell people stories. A politician can speak. A writer can write. Everybody can do something. And so each person here has a little part to play in that. And you should never feel it's insignificant, because I've learned through my experience that even me as a little photographer has been able to inspire other people to go and do something. Anyway, if I have the next slide. This was a story, and for me, it's the story I most enjoyed doing. It was in Ukraine, and I went to document street kids. And I ended up, the only way I felt I could really get involved with the story was to go and live with a group of street kids. So this was the bunch I ended up with, who were quite a bunch of kids. I remember the first night I slept in their squat with them, and they couldn't actually believe that I was going to spend the night there, and lying there with all my camera equipment and everything, just in this little corner. They were drinking vodka and laughing and looking at me. I couldn't understand a word they were saying, and so it was a sleepless night. This picture, though, was taken quite a long time later, and by then I'd become very close to all of them. Sasha, who's the kid in the middle, he was the leader. He was leader by default, simply the fact he spent most time in jail, which meant he got the most respect. And he'd sort of taken a shining to me, and he decided this was my last day in Odessa, and so they'd taken me to the beach, to the Black Sea, for a day out. And it was a great lesson in trusting and understanding other people, because that's, for me, what I do. It's you have to trust other people. To get a good photograph, you have to trust them, and then in return, you get that trust. So anyway, so we'd gone to the beach, and I remembered when I'd first gone to Ukraine, I'd bought a Lonely Planet guide. And in it had sort of 10 things never ever to do. And among those were 3 particular bits of advice. And one was the crime. The big problem in Odessa is crime. So they said, whatever you do, watch your stuff at all times. Secondly was avoid all street kids. And the third was, under no circumstances, go swimming in the Black Sea. So there I was. I stood next to Sasha, and we're drinking vodka. And Sasha's like, you and me, we go swimming. No, you must. So in the end, I had to strip down to my boxer shorts with Sasha, and we just jumped off this pier after handing my camera, everything I owned, including my passport, to a bunch of street kids who were all looking at me like this, going, are you kidding? And I remember just swimming in the sea thinking, it was kind of nice, but thinking, this is going to be one of those stories where I kind of walk down to the police station in wet boxer shorts. And I said, what happened? Well, I just gave my stuff to a bunch of street kids, and they went for a swim in the Black Sea. But it worked out. And as I say, it was a good example for me about trusting. The sad thing about this picture, though, is at the top right, there's a kid there called Lilik. He was a really sweet little street kid. Wasn't sure exactly of his age, maybe 13. And on this particular day, he's the one that looked after my camera. And he went around taking photographs. We'd just actually, earlier in the morning, we'd broken into an aquarium. Or rather, they had broken in. I had documented their breaking in. And he'd used my camera to take pictures of the dolphins. And then when I was swimming, he'd borrowed my camera again. And he'd done something that showed a real photographic intelligence, you could call it. He'd been banging on the ground trying to get these seagulls to take off, because he wanted them to take off so he could take these photographs of the seagulls against the sky. And that's really intuitive, because it's saying, not just pointing a camera in a direction, but seeing something and wanting to create an image and making that happen. And we talked about lending him a camera, or maybe I'd try and get him a camera and send it over when I got back to the UK. That night I had to go back and get all my stuff, and in the morning I went to say goodbye to all these kids in their squat, and Lilik was dead. He'd taken a bunch of pills that he'd nicked from a hospital and a load of vodka, and he didn't wake up in the morning. And it was a reminder that these people have stories and they have lives that we should all appreciate and understand. And as I say, for me, it's an honor that I can go around and I can record them. If I come to the next slide. And then this is the kind of, the way things have then changed for me, is that in doing all this, earlier this year, I stepped on an IED and in so doing so became part of the story myself. When it first happened, I didn't want any press, I didn't want any interest in it. But then I realized that actually most of my life has been spent recording the consequences of conflict and how that affects people. And I had actually become that myself. And in a strange way, I'd almost become a bit of a performance art. My body had become a record of what war can do to people. And I realized it was important that I should then record that myself. And so I did this self-portrait a couple of months ago. I wanted to show the injuries as they are so that people could really understand what happens to somebody when they step on an IED. We talk about people losing their limbs as if it's something somehow abstract. But in fact, they're ripped from you, they're taken from you. And this picture hopefully shows that. But it also shows what I've always tried to do in my photographs, and that is to show people not as victims, but victims of circumstance. I don't see myself as a victim. I was doing a job that I love, a job that I'm incredibly passionate about, and that I was privileged to do. I got hurt doing it. These things happen. I will continue to do that work. I'm the same person. And I hope, you know, in speaking to you and showing some of these pictures, maybe some other people will be inspired as well to go and do whatever they can do. And hopefully in this case, it might just be to write a letter, but doing that can make a difference. Thank you.